Hey everyone, I wanted to follow up on our episode on Avenging Crassus by taking a closer look at the Battle of Carrhae or Carrhae, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. In any case, Carrhae was one of Rome's worst defeats, as we have seen, and it's often portrayed as the result of Crassus's own bumbling idiocy. To the modern reader, his actions appear completely irrational and doomed to failure. However, I do want to note that this is the view of the armchair general, who all too often looks at this and thinks that they could have done better. But we have to remember that hindsight is 20/20, and that our written records are often biased themselves, and that they often look for scapegoats and a simple, moralizing story to tell. It's for these reasons that I figured we'd try and peer into the mind of Crassus, and ask, what was he thinking? We can start off with the very idea of the campaign itself. People often frame Crassus as a politician with no military acumen who launched himself into a uniquely greedy campaign. Yet both of these ideas are actually wrong. Crassus did in fact have military experience. He had led troops in Sulla's civil war and was actually the commander who turned the tide at the Battle of the Colline Gate. After climbing the Cursus Honorum, Crassus found himself leading several legions victoriously against Spartacus in the Third Servile War. Despite some initial difficulties, he seems to have handled himself better than his predecessors and showed the hallmarks of a competent general. He decisively instilled discipline, built earthworks to contain his enemies, and waged a methodical campaign to the bloody end. What is fair to say, though, is that he was probably a bit rusty, since there is a 2-decade gap between this action and the campaign against Parthia. Though I wouldn't necessarily count this against him, or point to it as a reason for why there was this eventual defeat at Carrhae. Let's now turn to that second idea we mentioned, the one where he states that his attack on Parthia was uniquely greedy. I'm going to state the obvious and say that his campaign was launched with basically no justifiable reason other than his own greed. That in and of itself seems pretty clear. But let's not pretend that this was unique to Crassus. Rome's wars had always been primarily driven by the personal ambition of commanders, who looked for any minor justification for conquest. This was especially true in the late Republic, when the political scene was dominated by those who managed to collect enough wealth and prestige through conquest to bully aside their peers. Crassus was just doing what others before him had done, though without the feeder of putting on airs to justify it. Yes, we have contemporaries roasting him for his actions, but this always happens among rival Roman politicians looking for any reason to cut down their opponent. We should note that Caesar actually wrote to Crassus from Gaul urging him to pursue a Parthian campaign, and that Cicero defended this position. The war in the East had also been something that was on the lips of many Roman politicians. Leading figures such as Pompey and Gamidius had contemplated it previously. So to recap thus far, I think we've been able to show that Crassus was showing rather typical Roman behavior for the period, but might have been operating at least on the far end of this spectrum. Yes, he would catch flack in the short term for what he was doing, but it was definitely not crazy to think that his actions would be wiped clean with a victory. This then begs the question, was victory something that was a reasonable expectation? Well, as we've mentioned, Crassus did have some military experience, and yes, while he was probably rusty, he did have the example of others to look at. Thus far, Roman campaigns in the East had been fairly easy. Armies fielded by Pontus or Armenia seemed to just melt away, leaving the Roman commanders to amass great wealth in the aftermath. To name just a few examples, in 86 BC, Sulla and 30,000 men had easily defeated a Pontic force of around 110,000, and again won the next year with just 16,000 against 75,000 enemy. In 69 BC, Lucullus and 40,000 men had defeated around 100,000 men under Tigranes, with only minor losses. In light of this evidence, it seems logical that Crassus may have expected similar results. However, the main flaw here was that these victories had been won against forces which mostly fought in the Hellenistic fashion with an infantry corps and supporting light infantry and cavalry that could be brought to battle. This would not be the case with the Parthians at Carrhae, though again, another important note here is that the main army operating with the Rhodes did in fact have mixed troops including infantry and cavalry. It was a bit of an oddity actually to see Serena with a force completely comprised of cavalry. But whatever way you look at it, this was in fact a new enemy for Rome, and this is where cries of "what was Crassus thinking" might ring the loudest. After all, you might think that encountering a new enemy, how could you expect to use the same tactics and win? Well, to some degree, this was just the Roman way. They had developed a military system built on flexible, heavy infantry forces, which thus far had won them a great empire against all kinds of enemies before using the same tried and true model. Up to this point, there may have been some issues with light and skirmishing forces in places like Iberia, but these were all eventually overcome. Thus far, no Roman commander had faced an entirely mounted army which operated, quite like the Parthians, with their famous bows. So I hope you appreciated this short form look into Invicta content. Now if you want to see our full length documentaries, you can head on over to the main channel, and either way, I'll see you in the next one.